Questions for reflection. All of our readings for today's Holy Mass speak to us about faith. Once again, in our reading from the Hebrew Scriptures, David does not trust the Lord to be with him in battle. Instead, he falls back onto his own plan, rooted not in faith, but in doubt. Joab, the commander of the army, even tries to assure the king that the Lord could add men to the army. But David relies on himself, and he suffers the consequences. This is the same David who, as a very young man, trusted the Lord enough to take a slingshot into a battle with a Goliath. And the Lord intervened miraculously. God had not changed. David had. How had his life, with all of its difficulties and his own poor choices, brought such erosion to this once mighty man? Well, that is what sin does. It corrodes. It separates. It clouds over our capacity to see clearly. Afterward, David immediately sees that he had made a wrong choice. And I quote, David then said to Yahweh, I have committed a grave sin by doing this. But now, Yahweh, I beg you to forgive your servant for this fault, for I have acted very foolishly. This is the right response. And it is never too late. So the Lord gave David a choice in punishment for his sin, his wrong choice, his lack of trust. Rather than fall into the hands of men, he chooses to fall into the hands of God. And an epidemic strikes the people whom he was responsible for. But our biblical account doesn't stop there. Notice, David pleads with the Lord on behalf of the people and offers to take all the consequences upon himself. Quote, he said to Yahweh, I was the one who sinned. I was the one who acted wrongly. But these, the flock, what have they done? Let your hand lie heavy on me and on my family. That's how a leader of people should act. It also reveals the character of David. Yes, he sinned. He made wrong choices, but he repented and learned from those mistakes and wrong choices. Do we learn from our own wrong choices? The psalm response for today's Holy Mass continues to teach us lessons from David. He was certainly not a perfect man. He sinned, he erred, but he was a man who repented and always turned back to God. He was a man who understood the power of faith. Listen to his words, and let us make them our own. Quote, how blessed are those whose offense is forgiven, whose sin blotted out. How blessed are those to whom Yahweh imputes no guilt, whose spirit harbors no deceit. I made my sin known to you, did not conceal my guilt. I said, I shall confess my offense to Yahweh. And you, for your part, took away my guilt, forgave my sin. David continues, that is why each of your faithful ones prays to you in times of distress. Even if great floods overflow, they'll never reach your faithful. You are a refuge for me. You guard me in trouble. With songs of deliverance, you surround me. In the gospel appointed for today's Mass, St. Mark shows us how Jesus is rejected in his own hometown. Why? Because he was a carpenter. Because he was the son of Mary and had extended family, just like his listeners. How could he be any different than them? And Jesus said this to them, a prophet is despised only in his own country, among his own relations, and in his own house. And he could work no miracle there, except that he cured a few sick people by laying his hands on them. Notice the connection the scriptures reveal between the lack of faith of the townspeople and the lack of miracles, of God's intervention in their own lives. That relationship should move every one of us to examine where we are in relationship to the Lord Jesus Christ. Do we have faith? Is it living faith? Do we act on it? Jesus is not dead. He's been raised from the dead and walks among us. He still speaks his word. He calls us to respond. Are we listening? Are we growing in our faith? Hear these words of the Lord. They should move us deeply. And Jesus said to them, and he could work no miracle there, except that he cured a few sick people by laying his hands on them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. Lord Jesus, please, by your grace, increase our faith.